Uh, Hello. Thank you, and welcome back to a discussion amongst the panelists, and then some Q&A with you and the panelists. So I don't exactly know where to start off here. Neither do you. So maybe, I'm sure that between the three of you, I mean, I have questions and comments and things that came to me, of course, but I'm sure the three of you do also. So you are the speakers, you prepared talks. Why don't we start out with asking for questions and discussion amongst yourselves?
I think, listening to Ben's talk, and I think all the talks in general, it's like, I think one of the things that I was really talking about that's really interesting to me, that is like, what is the future? We talk about all this, like, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to maybe understand this, define this, but like, what do you see as the future of embryos or Buddhism or whatever it is that, fascinates you here?
I'm going to turn that into a question for Robert. Robert, okay. It seemed to me that one of the observations you were making in the text that you were putting forth is the way that the effort to offer a kind of embryological analysis weaves in the dynamics of whatever is observable in biological development with a kind of fabric of relations that stretches all the way back into the infinite past and all the way forward into the infinite future. And the karma, I took it to essentially be that the fundamental nature of things lies not so much in the nature of those things, but in those karmic relations. That one makes sense of the nature of those things, the dynamics as they play out in a case of development in karmic terms, which it seems to me has two important implications. One is that that basic fabric has to do with conduct, the way one lives, not what one lives as or how that life
absolutely
operates or whatever. And that number two, past and future are sort of neither here nor there. And so the linearity associated with Josie's question just now, it seems to me maybe is the wrong kind of question.
Well, the past doesn't matter anymore in a way, but the future matters because the goal is liberation or nirvana, and that's by definition in the future. So
I guess what I meant by that is that the present is reinscribing the past that has come before, and there's a kind of infinite horizon within which the future can play out, oriented towards achieving that goal. Is that not right? Asking what happens next as though it's independent of the agency.
Oh, okay, asking what happens next. What happens next is definitely dependent upon what has happened before. But what?
I guess my point is just that it's a different kind of temporal horizon. It's a different relation to the future.
Okay, I can accept that.
Are you Buddhist, Robert?
No longer,
Oh, yeah? Interesting. Why do you say that?
because I started studying Buddhism academically.
Oh!
And frankly, the question that what did it for me was thinking about rebirth,
Oh, yeah? Why?
because I don't believe in rebirth. Sorry.
Oh yeah, is it hard? I mean, so looking at it from my perspective, like a scientific perspective, I don't know. I think there are a lot of things out there that we totally don't understand and can't measure even a little bit. And I don't know, like, that's the hardest thing for you to come to terms with, or?
Well, without rebirth, there can't be karma.
Mm-hmm.
And Buddhism, karma is very important in Buddhism.
Yeah.
So, okay, I will say I am an agnostic.
Interesting.
Thank you for that embarrassing question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know it was embarrassing.
You know,
Please forgive me.
if I can jump in here, the dependent origination and karma, these are extremely central, as we all know, to the Buddhist project. I'm going to say, and I'm asking this out there to the panelists, I think of it in two different directions that it's quite important. And one, of course, is the moral dimension. And you spoke a bit about, the moral dimension of things. And the other dimension is the countless lifetimes that are usually posited as a requirement for achieving the complete awakening of a Buddha. And to my mind, the moral dimension doesn't really need rebirth to still kind of work. I think that the Eightfold Path works fairly well as a moral program for getting what you want in this life, happiness and well-being. But, if countless rebirths are necessary for awakening, and if rebirth isn't actually operational, it's not an operant factor for you and your way of understanding things, then what? Maybe a simple attenuation of your suffering or practices of positive psychology to be a little bit better person in this life is a better use of your time than 30 years in a cave. So I want to throw that one out there.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the things I talked about and was really interested in is like, do we need those countless lifetimes? And in the future, what if you can just skip all that? Is that cheating? Or is that, or is that just like okay in the Buddhist religion and philosophy?
For some Buddhists,
Spirituality.
it's
Oh, yeah?
cheating, and for some Buddhists, it's what you should be doing.
Again, from my understanding of Buddhism is that Buddhism has always wanted to make use of any and every technological advance to achieve the elimination of suffering and a greater well-being for all beings. I think probably, classically speaking, Buddhist Tantra is the best example of that. The idea in Buddhist Tantra, really largely writ, is that we're in a degenerate period of time after the Buddha. The practice and realization of Dharma declines after the historical Buddhist passing. And so in difficult times and difficult straits, we need strong medicine. We need stronger medicine. We need different techniques. And so these tantric methods evolved, which, for those of you who know about them, are pretty kind of strong methods. And so I think that Buddhism has always been very positive about using every means at its disposal. I throw that back to the other panelists too,
Certainly from the development of Tantric Buddhism, but what about before? Before the idea of being able to become enlightened in one lifetime, for example, when you say it's always wanted to use new developments, what is your basis?
I'll throw that back to the panelists for the moment. I gave my piece. Well, okay, then leave Buddhism out of it. If you're not a Buddhist, we can ask the same kind of question. Josie brought this up in terms of talking about positive developments and nudging towards the alleviation, artificial nudging towards the alleviation of suffering. Jay Hughes out there, transhumanism has always been all about that. So taking it out of the Buddhist realm and the morality that Ben brought up earlier today also. Let's ask the question outside of the Buddhist realm. I'm not quite sure about Thomas Aquinas at the end there, having a strong Catholic upbringing. Thomas Aquinas has different resonance for me, and the idea of human reason and the position of that, especially vis-a-vis Buddhism. But
Well, I mean, I guess I would be wary of collapsing the difference between the elimination of suffering and the transcendence of suffering. Isn't that kind of a key distinction?
how so?
Well, I mean, everybody can overcome suffering by being anesthetized permanently right now, right?
That's another can of worms. That might be one definition of Buddhahood.
All I'm saying is the re-representation of fundamental dimensions of human life in some technological simulacrum is like that artificial mouse that isn't a mouse, right? I mean, it's an appropriation and recasting of a thing that is not the thing anymore, or pretends to be the thing but isn't, or isn't the thing but pretends to be. I mean, it seemed to me that the kind of selfing that James Hughes was talking about earlier is not I mean, those are selves that I don't have any particular interest myself in engaging with as selves, right? I mean, it's not a question of what are my ethical obligations to an AI, but I mean, if an AI is going to write me term papers or be my main interlocutor or comfort me when I'm sad because of the death of a family member, or pretend to be the family member that I miss, or whatever. I mean, who's the less than human in that scenario? It seems to me that it's me. And so, I mean, but these are sort of technological thought experiments in which we reconstruct fundamental human relations as though they are captured by these simulacra, these artificial, attenuated, I mean, you can call it a self, but it ain't a self in the sense that a self has had a significance, including the sort of self that aspires to a kind of selflessness, right? I mean, if you can shape it to fool yourself into thinking that it's the kind of thing that you care about, so much the worse for you. You're much less than you were before. Anyway, my point is, elimination of suffering, transcendence of suffering. There's a lot of talk about elimination of suffering in a sort of thin utilitarian sense of suffering as a sort of intrinsic bad that needs to be cleansed from human being, by remedying it somehow with whatever the right sort of medicine is for it. But that seems to me, I mean, I don't know much about Buddhism, but that doesn't seem to me to be what Buddhism is about, as far as I know.
And there is, there is a form of Buddhism very prevalent in East Asia, certainly in Japan where I live, that is not about either transcendence or elimination of suffering. The Pure Land tradition, the Jodo Shinshu tradition in Japan, that is precisely about the recognition that we are human, and to be human is to suffer. And my good Catholic mother, going back to Thomas Aquinas, would never have dreamed of, she never would have woken up in the morning and had an idea that she was going to have a day without any obstacles in it. It wouldn't occur to her. So, interesting and good point. Thank you.
Yeah. When I first started, when I was first invited here and I started thinking about this stuff, it had me thinking about, though, like, if overcoming, I first started thinking about, like, what if I could genetically engineer an animal or all animals to have sapient-like intelligence or consciousness to help them have a better opportunity to reach enlightenment or nirvana? Would that be pursuing a path of transcendence for them, or the same if you think about technology? If I pursue a path of technology to reach enlightenment, is that transcendence? Is that reaching through the transcendence of the suffering? Or Is that just like you said, an elimination, a cheating almost?
If nobody's going to answer that one, I would go back to, I want to talk about the synthetic embryos that we heard about from Jacob, and then a little bit further on with Ben, and putting that into conversation with Rob's talk about sort of the technical understanding of how consciousness enters from the antarabhava into an embryo. It seems to me that the synthetic embryo, while I understand what could happen in the earlier versions of where we were getting stem cells from, now in the research where that's not the process anymore, they're created synthetically outside of that process. I can understand where an aborted fetus ends up in another stream. Where does the Buddhist version of consciousness come from in a synthetic embryo?
Where indeed?
Ben's looking pensive.
I mean, it's a metaphysical question I'm definitely not equipped to address. I guess that I would just point out the obvious thing, which is one of the things I was trying to point out, which is just because it's in a lab somewhere, just because it has the word artificial in front of it, just because it's sort of cordoned off from everything else, doesn't mean that it's not in some way participating in that larger picture and impacting it in some way. And you don't need to ask the question, is this entity in the rotating bottle, in this moral box or that moral box, in order to recognize that there are stakes associated with this, because it is, in effect, a transformation of reproduction, which is itself a word that we tend to use more than procreation, and the fact that we prefer the language of production over it itself strikes me as significant. So the interconnectedness of things that I took, at least, to be one of the key elements of Robert's sort of exegetical account, I thought was pretty important to bring back to these domains of to these technological domains where things seem like they live in their own discrete, distinct laboratory world and have nothing to do with quote-unquote natural things, which is false.
I'd like to say something that I maybe meant to say in my presentation but didn't get around to, which is, if we're creating new life somehow, and if Buddhism, one of the basic tenets of Buddhism is that everything is suffering, is it doing a good thing to create a new life in any sense?
There's a very well-known book called Better Never to Have Been Born. And it has raised quite a host of issues along these lines. A Korean Buddhist monk once startled my undergraduate class by declaring that he thinks that he and his partner's most significant contribution to the world is that they have never procreated. And I had to sort of follow that down to find that there was a basis in this book called Better Never to Have Been Born. So it's a very interesting one. I disagreed with him, but that's me. That's the Shin Buddhist in me.
Do you want to?
Up. Here. We have Ifa Sensei.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Yeah. I'd like to respond to Robert. You keep saying like if a Buddhism teaching about suffering. I think that this is a kind of okay, I would say it's a misunderstanding. Because when we talk about 苦集灭道, the four noble truths, everyone just got stuck at the first Four Noble Truths suffering. Okay, because we have to move to the second one to find what is the cause of the suffering, and then the path to get rid of the suffering. I think the goal is to finally to get rid of the suffering. It's the nirvana. So I hope that when everyone talk about Buddhism, should move on to what is the nirvana? It's the ultimate happiness. This is the one thing I want to correct. I always tell people that if you are studying Buddhism, you still feel unhappy. You must be on the wrong path. Okay. And the secondly, the reason I bring this embryo issue is I find very interesting because started from the what we call the IVF, the test tube baby in the last century, it's already challenged this, what the Buddha talk about in this embryo sutra. But every time when the Buddha talk about certain thing, it's just kind of a partially. For example, the Buddha also mentioned 4 kinds of birth. We have the womb birth, 四生, and then egg, bones, and then also moisture, bones, and then finally spontaneous bone. If I can translate that. And what will be? They will be like born in hell, born in even in heaven or in Pure Land. So without parents, there was a certain way of the birth you can without parents. So it's very interesting that if in the future, in science also can prove that we can have a birth without parents. I think that there's still kind of a Buddhism also in this kind of include, different various form of birth. Okay, so I will not just limit it in, human being, as just kind of, warm being. Of course, I mean, surrogate. This morning I will talk about surrogate as well. It's just the science just keep a push to challenge. But when we come to Buddhism, I believe that sometimes we will find like a Buddhism is more like a kind of myth. There was language. It's more like a mystical, like what is the huashen? What is the spontaneous born? We don't see it. Maybe the science can help to see it. It's amazing. Maybe in the future, really we could have a sentient human being. Maybe. How about AI? AI could be another kind of, I always call AI will be a new species. And then people say, well, then AI, what will be the AI in which realm? Because right now we have 6 realms. Okay, heaven, and then also human and animal and hungry ghosts and hell. But originally it was 5, and later they added, the ashram. Yeah? But it could also have a new species. And right now, like a dinosaurs, it's gone. And we can have a new kinds of what we call the sentient being. So you need to be more like a wider to think about all this issue. As a practitioner, in Buddhism, that's the way I approach Buddhism. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you.
We have a question from the audience. I guess
Yes.
we're moving on to the audience participation at this point.
Yes, thank you. My name's Ted from Tzu Chi Foundation. I want to circle back to Professor Kwitzer's comment on not believing in rebirth. I think you're probably aware that there's a growing body of research in this area, and I wonder that what your thoughts are and how you came to your conclusion not to believe in rebirth.
What my thoughts are about investigations, modern investigations into the possibility of rebirth? Is that what you're saying?
That's right.
My limited, overly literal mind does not allow does not allow me. I try to think about it, and it just doesn't make sense to me. So I can't, this is probably not the audience that's necessarily sympathetic to that view, but that's the way that I've seen things.
Anybody else want to? Are you guys believers in rebirth?
I'm not Buddhist at all, so, but, studying Buddhism before I came here and really trying to understand it on different levels, on a scientific level and everything like that. I mean, I remember when I went and I got my PhD, and I started to see the world as like there's fact and there's not fact, and there's data and there's not data. And if it wasn't fact or data, it wasn't true. But after I left the academy and was gone for a while, I started to realize that, like, there's a lot we don't know. I mentioned this in my talk. People 150 years ago, the way they would view us, we know more than them, but we know less than everybody after us. Everybody after us is going to know so much more. What are they going to know that we think is crazy or don't understand? And I think some of those are these intangible things, right? Like, and one of those I think is consciousness. And to try to imagine that there's a stream of consciousness or karmic stream or something that we can get caught up into in rebirth, like, why not? I don't know. I imagine just like, why not? Is that really the craziest thing? If I told you that quantum mechanics to somebody from 1,000 years ago, they would think I was insane. Or that we would shoot rockets into space, they'd be like, no, that doesn't even make any sense. Impossible, crazy, what does that even mean? Right? And so is it that crazy to imagine that there's things we don't understand yet that we can see, we just can't measure right now? Just like consciousness and things like, my point of view.
I like this. Could we have imagined that we would make sand think? That's a powerful one.
Right? Like, no, nobody would believe that if you told them, like, we made sand think. They'd be like, what? What are you talking about? Right?
One of the questions that comes up is so we can think in terms of panpsychic notions that came up, and maybe that was a little bit of what Ben was referring to or alluding to a while ago. But the issue with that, I think, for Buddhists is how does that contribute to a sense of karmic continuity that includes responsibility, such that this thing that constitutes Jamie here today is somehow related to something else other than a great cosmic panpsychic universe in which I can imagine us all participating in that life. That's not hard to imagine. But I think that the Buddhist notion of the continuity of life in rebirth has is much a stronger version of personal continuity than that panpsychic version of life. Jiji Muge, the infinitely interrelated holographic nature of the universe as alive, is a very different version than a more personal continuity that I think classic Buddhism, in many ways, is after.
Which, it seems to me, means that rebirth, no rebirth, what's the universe made of, what's the fabric of consciousness, doesn't actually matter too much for the kind of life you live in the life that you have in the moment, which is, of course, the central point, is it not? That one ought to live that life according to a set of defining aspirations, whether that continues through an infinite number of lives or only one?
Other questions?
Well, I mean, let me just say as a sort of follow-up to that, it seems to me that even as worthwhile as it is to ask these questions, it's also worth remembering that as Jay Hughes pointed out earlier, that the process of human quote-unquote progress entails from the outset processes of forgetting, that the production of knowledge is also production of corollary forms of ignorance. I mean, to use the example of the Phaedrus and the death of the advent of writing and the death of memory or whatever. But I love that Eliot line, advancing progressively backwards. And so we ought not be overly confident in our capacity to increase the stock of knowledge such that it produces forms of mastery that displace the need to aspire to be good because we have produced forms of perfection that make it just happen without our ethical commitment and agency, right? Which also seems to me to render kind of secondary the questions that sometimes are getting presented as primary.
You brought up Jay Hughes, and here he is.
Well, I would just say to Robert that I think you can find within Buddhism a deeply pragmatic strain as well that dispenses with frippery questions and says, focus on the task at hand. So I have always called myself a Buddhist, and I know that half of the world doesn't think I'm a Buddhist because I don't believe in reincarnation, but I don't care. But in terms of Ben, I just have a quick question. You were trying to deconstruct the significance of saying something is human or not, but you also pointed to laws that said you could do research, you can't do research on human embryos, but you could do research on animals. So you know that Jeremy Rifkin tried to file a suit with the patent office in the US 25 years ago that said, I want to make a half human, half chimpanzee embryo. And should I be allowed to do that? He wanted the patent office to say, you can have this many human genes, and then beyond that you can't, which I think is a dumb way to go about it in the first place. But if I gave you like 12 embryos between a pig and a human, and the 10 in between were the transgenic ones, you would have to make a decision at some point. It's not human enough for your purposes. And it's not a decision based on anything that's morally significant, just how many genes they had, right? So isn't that kind of determination significant if you're going to start talking about what's human and what's not? And isn't it morally irrelevant because all it's saying is that they have this kind of gene versus that kind of gene?
Yeah, so it's a good case. So it wasn't just Jeremy Rifkin, it was teamed up with Stuart Newman, who is a good friend, he is an embryologist. And what they did was they filed a patent on human, non-human embryonic mixtures, okay? And the key point of that was not to get the US Patent Office to draw a clear line that defined what a human was. The point of that was to demonstrate that the US Patent Office is the one who gets to draw a line that says what a human is or isn't, right? It was an intervention through a kind of, it was pointing out the way in which a fundamental ethical question, which is a fundamental political question, had in effect de facto got rendered a technocratic question in the moment that the US Supreme Court authorized the patenting of a genetically modified microbe. That the continuity that takes you to the point of human, non-human demarcation as something that a nameless patent technocrat gets to discern is a reflection of an important unthought in the fabric of law that fosters innovation of the sort that Josie was talking about in ways that Henry was pointing to this morning in other domains. So I think it's an important point, but the point is not, wow, we really have to just figure out exactly where that line is. I think the more fundamental point is that the project of figuring out that problem and immediately transmuting that problem into a definitional problem that is also a technical problem and thus a technocratic problem, that's a problem.
Thank you. James Robson?
Okay, thank you. So I think one of the things that's animated a lot of the discussions between Buddhism and science over the last, say, 20, 25 years and more even, has been the attempt to say that so many of the recent developments in science have some correlates already found in the Buddhist teaching. So basically everything that Josie was mentioning as being unthinkable 2,000 years ago, in fact, the issues of, say, just thinking of atomic theory, even quantum mechanics, if one talks about the emptiness of dharmas, of the constituents, people will say, yeah, this was already taught by the Buddha. One could think about the enhancements of human through genetic modifications and things like that. One would say, okay, at the time of the Buddha, by becoming a Buddha, what does he do? He gets the enhancements of an ear that can hear 1,000 miles away, eyes that can see forever, the ability to see past lives, a tongue that can turn all bad tastes into good tastes, things like. So one could, sort of get into this game of correspondences between what the Buddha taught in those texts and what is being developed now. And so the question of what is going to be unthought of is a really intriguing one. But I wonder, according from a Buddhist perspective, everything that the Buddha taught was the truth. And, this ability to sort of look back and find those. I'd leave that just, I'm not sure, I personally don't want to get in always to the game of just looking for that kind of correspondence between the two. But the issue of that Ben brought up was the first time somebody mentioned ignorance and the importance of ignorance. In fact, all this discussion of suffering, according to the Buddhist tradition, is not because life is all suffering. Ifa Fasher here tried to put it in a larger perspective, but Rob had put up the 12-fold chain of causation. What's the beginning is ignorance. That's the fundamental problem of all suffering. Jamie's shaking his head, but nonetheless, it's right there from the beginning, and that's a human problem. So the issue of putting, what Josie was imagining, this kind of sentience into animals, maybe getting it wrong, and maybe we need a little bit more of the animal brain in us, because again, there's different traditions of Buddhism. Jamie was giving a very Theravada long view of multiple lifetimes, eons and gazillions of rebirths. But according to other traditions that have developed, some will label them heresies, but something like the Zen tradition or others who collapse everything into this lifetime, there is a kind of valorization of a like being an animal in the world, in the sense, no second order cognition. An animal just does what it does. It is what it is. And when a tiger strikes, I mean, this is your William Blake, if we're going to cite, tiger, tiger, burning bright, just act, just to strike. No thought about that. That's, in a sense, what the Zen tradition is telling us, to be in the world like that, and just to act. Just don't allow the cognitive side to take over, where ignorance then comes in and screws us up, and that's where desire comes in. And that's one of my fears, I think, of this whole bioengineering side of things, is a lot of that is perhaps driven by desire. In other words, where do we draw the line between, say, enhancements that limit or mitigate suffering versus purely just desires that enhance? Where do we draw the line, say, with just a desire for some category called beauty, for example, or something that we just want? I mean, desire can carry over into that as well. So I'm not sure if there's a question in there, but just to comment on some of the things that have been said. And I see I've made Jamie shake his head about ignorance, but maybe I'm ignorant of something he knows, so thank you.
Thank you. I was just, in the Four Noble Truths, desire is the problem. In the 12 Links, ignorance comes before desire, so that's a complicated Buddhological question. But there were some other hands up I saw over here, some of the monastics, I think. Yes? Hi, thank you.
好，就是尊敬的依法法师，还有诸位贵宾，就是我用中文来做询问。Robert 先生，こんにちは。私も京都仏教大学卒業です。我的问题大概就是想要请问台上的诸位的那个教授， 就是这一次的论坛的主题叫佛学基因与生命，所以生命它是一个重点。我们今天这个议题在讨论的是合成胚胎。那合成胚胎它有没有生命？根据罗伯特教授的从各种的经典来看，它从受精卵或者是开始第一周、第二周，它的这个胚胎的意识，它就已经形成了，也就是于切斯蒂人所讲的中阴身，它在进来的时候，它在父精母血结合的那一刹那，就是男女行淫欲的时候，它这时候就有生命的一个形成，这是在我们佛法所讲的毋庸置疑的一个理论。那现在呢，依法法师他来做这样子一个论坛，他也是想要了解，就是我相信他已经很了解了，只是就是现在科技的合成胚胎，他可能对于现在的一些不孕症的人，或者是他等待器官捐赠的人，或者他在老化的过程，他需要有一副新的这个色身的躯体来延续他的这个生命的人而言，他或许他是需要的。可是这样子的胚胎的一个形成，它有没有生命？它有没有生命？如果它有生命，我们做这样子的行为，是否是在剥夺了另一条有灵魂的生命，来圆满这一世的我们自私的人们所要渴望的，它的这个器官、它的干细胞、它的一些的就是色身，来圆满我们自己的不要老病死。好，这是第一个。第二个。
Okay, I try to do a brief translation. So the question is, according to Venerable Huiming's understanding of the sutra, so the embryo already have a life, because the embryo already have consciousness at the time of conception. So then the question is, if somebody who really needs badly like an organ for kidney or liver, so if we somehow manage to make an substitute organ, so does that organ have life? So that's a good question. So if it does, then of course there's bring up all these ethical concerns. So that's the Venerable Huiming's questions.
What I'd say is, from practical consideration, from my point of view, embryonic research and using these techniques to improve life, to improve the world is great. But I just don't see how from the point of view of first millennial Buddhists, I don't see how it fits together. That's my main feeling. So I don't negate the value of Buddhist practice, but I don't really see how Buddhism and synthetic embryos intersect. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question here. Doctor? Doctor?
Hello, everybody. And I'm an oncologist who cares cancer patient, but I'm also a nun. So for me, you can see you say it's confusion. For me, it's a harmony in the science and the religions. And for the vulnerable women's questions to concern about whether the ethical issue about life in scientific and Buddhism, I would say that based on religions, people's concept, all religions, I think, all hesitate about embodied technology because they will see that is a life. No matter it's when the egg meets the sperm, it's the consciousness start based on the Buddhism or by other even religions' perspective. But you know why the research now received in the 40 days for the stem cell technology. This rule is set in around 1970s. At the time, the science research cannot do that biotechnically. So it's a compromise because between the science and religions, between the science or morals, because they think between 14 days, the cell only have 2 layers about embryonic cell. So they don't have the differentiation function. And they believe probably the early embryonic cell, they don't have neural connection. Based on this compromise, I would say that is compromise. They think 14 days could be a limit for the technology or science to do some research, primary research, to have some technological or new drug development or know why the gene defect based on this limitation. But it's on 1970. Nowadays, the technology evolves so quickly beyond those limitations, and most scientists want to take forward to test the limitation of the 28 days. Then the religion people will have argue about it. What the time the consciousness come in. Even I'm a Buddhist nun, I still wonder about that because you have all heard about some story or again that when a mother had pregnant, they got a dream, probably in her pregnant for months, they dreamed an elephant or something good enter his body, and they have a good baby as a master. So I have talked to Eva and other vulnerable. Probably the conscious come in our body, maybe it's a period, not a time point. I'm not sure. I'm a nun. I will not say all my words is correct because I'm also a scientist. There always conflict and harmony in my heart. So I just want to echo that 40 days for the technology, embryonic technology is a compromise right now. Whether it could be stepped out, need to be discussed. Thank you.
I think that we have run out of time. So I want to thank our panelists very much for very stimulating conversations, and the audience as well for participating and continuing the conversation, and for Wooden Fish and the Venerable Ifa for fomenting all of this. Thank you so much.